Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Evans. I work for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and I'm here to talk to you guys about soils today. So the first thing about soils, where do they come from? Does anybody know? So just like you and I have parents, soils have a parent material as well. And does anybody know what that parent material is? So if we dug way deep down into the ground until we couldn't dig anymore, and we hit what we hit that was solid that we couldn't get through with a shovel or a hoe or anything like that to help us dig, we hit rock, called bedrock. And so that is that soil's parent material. And so how does that rock turn from a rock into soil particles? Over time they get broken down by things such as mechanical weathering and chemical weathering. So examples of chemical weathering would be something like acid rain that you hear about sometimes and learn about in environmental science class. That's probably the most commonly occurring one if you know anywhere that it does occur at. So mechanical weathering would be something such as taking a hammer and hitting a rock and making it break apart. So when you take that hammer and you smash that rock, it breaks into smaller pieces, right? So the same thing applies to mechanical weathering on rocks to create soil. There's also a place that you guys may be familiar with called Dusty Divot that used to exist in Fortnite a long time ago. And that came from a meteorite hitting and landing in the middle of the map of that game. And so it created this big divot in the middle of the map, right? So that's one way that some rocks were broken apart millions and millions of years ago. Some other examples of mechanical weathering would be like when you go fishing and you find a very smooth rock on the bank. That happens when the currents of that pond or that stream have caused that rock to tumble so much they've worn it down and smoothed it out. So those are some of your very common forms of mechanical weathering, even though some don't happen like they used to. So once we've broken down those rocks, they need to transform sometimes into what we call our soil. And there are three different types of soil sizes. Does anybody know what they are? So we've got sand, silt, and clay. Now, does anybody know which one is the biggest? So our biggest would be sand, which will be represented by this kickball we've got here. Because it's pretty, sand's, you know, in terms of size of the particles, it's pretty big and you can see one individual piece of it. The next biggest piece, or in the middle, would be silt. S-I-L-T, not to be confused with spider silk or the material for clothing, silk. Silt is very smooth and fine, feels kind of like baby powder a little bit. It's kind of dusty feeling too. And the smallest would be clay. You can't really see one individual grain of clay unless you have a very powerful microscope. And that's what we use to see clay sometimes. When you see clay on the ground, it's because there are thousands and millions of little pieces of clay stuck together that allow us to be able to see it. So now that we have our three different types of soil particles, we've got the different textures of soil, which of course are sand, silt, and clay textures. But we can also have combinations of all three, or just of two. We can have a sandy clay or a clayey sand, and you know, different types of combinations. When you have a mixture of evenly distributed of all three, it's called a loam. And that's a very good soil to grow things in. So now that we know that about soil, is soil living or do things live in the soil? Well, things live in the soil. Soil itself is not living. So some examples of things that live in the soil would be what? We have earthworms, we have ants, we have even larger critters like snakes, rabbits, crawdads, even crabs on the beach live in the sand sometimes. So those are all critters that live in the soil and create pore space in it too. Those pores can be micropores, the really small pores, and macropores, are really big pores that you can see with your naked eye. And these are both equally important, and they serve different roles. Our macropores, of course, hold air and water in it that's more easily accessible for our plants to use to grow with their roots. And the micropores kind of act as a reservoir and store that water and air in times that they need it. So here we've got a little example of a soil clod, and of course you can see we've got our different sized particles. We've got our clay, In our sand, we've got our silt, we've got our clay, and we've also got some pore space in it. Now, one really cool thing about some of these critters that live in the soil, especially earthworms, is that when they move through the soil, they don't go to the restroom like you and I do. They just go wherever. So those worms, especially when they go through, when they excrete their waste from it, it leaves this glue-like substance that we call glomalin in it. And that helps also give some structure to the soil and help the particles stick together to make soil clods that are much better in structure for our plants to grow in and also affect our textures of our soil. Clod, and this is going to be our worm. And this hole in this can is going to be our worm excreting all the waste on this. Well, there we go. So this is that glue or that glomalin I just talked about on this soil clod. Now I know it's not really going to help this stick together, but over time and with a lot of this stuff in this soil, it does help these soil particles and clods stick together a lot better and give some soil some structure. And so now that we've gone through all that, our kind of soil basics, let's kind of get into the theme a little bit for you guys this year, which is we all live in a watershed. So watershed, of course, yes, has got to do with water, meaning our oceans, our rivers, our streams, creeks, springs, all that good stuff, even the rain cycle, all comes into play on this watershed because the runoff from these watersheds has to go somewhere. But soil also plays a part. So we've got a project in the county too right now that focuses on the middle and east prong of the Rowan rivers. Those watersheds are heavily impacted by sediment in those streams, affecting the turbidity, the amount of sediment in it, and even sometimes flooding with it, depending on how bad those are in certain parts. Think about when you see it raining a whole lot here and you are in town and you see the Yadkin River and it looks just red, running red all the time. That's because of that sediment from that red clay that is so prominent here in Wilkes County. Those clay particles from that runoff do not settle into the stream quickly. Clay does not settle as easily as something like sand that's heavier and larger. So that's why when you see a river running red, it's the clay particles or whatever sediment particles there are, they're still suspended in that water and not settling. A good way to kind of visualize or picture how these pores come into play and affect the soil clod, think about your home. You know, your home has, of course, a living room, a kitchen, your bedroom, your bathroom, all rooms that are different sizes. Some are bigger, some are smaller. Your bathroom might be a little smaller than the living room or your bedroom, and the closet in your bedroom may be smaller than your bedroom. It should, more than likely, is smaller. So imagine you're just a little earthworm at home, and all of a sudden you just feel something shaking, and it's a bulldozer coming and bulldozing your home. Now what just happened to all those rooms in your house? They just all got smaller or basically non-existent at this point. You're just one open soil clod conduit. Now when that happens with a tiller, when your grandparents or whoever's out tilling in a garden, those micropores and macropores we had, guess what just happened to them? They just got smaller. So our micropores are even smaller and have less availability of water and moisture in them compared to before, and our macropores are smaller and may not even be macropores anymore at all. And that can affect the amount of water and air that plants have available in that soil clod. Now in agricultural terms, we use soil to grow things in, of course. So what are some common practices that we do with our soil when we're growing things? One thing that we see a lot of here, especially for tobacco, would be plowing it first. Now who thinks plowing is good? What if I told you that it's not good? Because over time, plowing it creates this hard, impermeable layer for roots and the water to get through in the lower levels of that soil. So we plow and it makes it easier for us to plant things up top with, yes, but what'll happen with our plant roots is they'll go down till they can't go through it and they just start to spread out and kind of go at a right angle almost. And that's not good because you want your roots to be deeper so they can have, that plant isn't as uprooted as easily and that it can get more nutrients and water from deeper down that soil. Now an alternative to tilling would be doing no-till. And that's when we take an instrument called a no-till drill that you hook up behind your tractor or even a small RTV or ATV, and it cuts a little slit in the ground, drops the seed, and covers it back up. And that's less disruptive on the soil surface and does not affect our pores at all. Our pores are still fairly intact, and we don't have a plow pan coming up or being created further down below. So that's how we kind of, a new alternative or a more recent alternative in the agricultural industry to help combat some of this tillage and compaction issues. So now that we're talking about compaction and no-till, so now that we've talked about tilled up soil and no-till soil, or tillage and non-tillage practices in agricultural practices, let's show an example of how those can be beneficial to our soils. So here we have a tilled up clod of soil. We have a clod of soil that's been in no-till for a while. This is called a slake test, and so I'm going to drop these in this water on this grate, and we're going to see how being under so much water affects if they break down or not. So let's do it on 3. 1, 2, 3. Now, what is one doing that the other is not doing? This one's very quickly and easily coming apart, while on this one we just have some bubbles coming and maybe a few pieces falling, but that's nothing compared to what's coming out on this. See all this red stuff? That's that clay, and yes, some's hitting the ground, the bottom of it, but it still has a red tinge, meaning that all those particles have not settled at all. And even if I take this no-till and shake it, some falls off, but it goes on and settles to the bottom, and it's not really changing the color of it. Now, if you had a choice of which one you wanted to have to drink or live next to, which one would you choose? The one full of clay particles that constantly looks like a bomb went off, or the one of no-till that, yeah, breaks apart some, but we don't have nearly the issue, as bad an issue of sediment in that water as we do in one. And if you come up close, you can also see some of that glomalin we talked about up on attaching to the edge of this grate here. Very faint, but you can see some of it. It's kind of in these bubbles a little bit. It's kind of a white looking thing. It's not as easy to see on camera maybe, but all that is that organic matter that had nowhere to go, and it's attaching to something again and staying suspended. While in our no-till, it's staying intact for the most part. We're not losing those blues. I think that's it. For joining me today, and I hope you guys learned something new.